So as we continue to think about Jesus being fully God, as Christians, it's probably something that we take for granted, but it's not always been so. And there's been lots of debates over the centuries about whether Jesus was fully God, fully man, part God, part man, and how that all worked. And we might think that this isn't important, but as we've seen, you can see the Jehovah's Witnesses or Islam or even Judaism would all disagree with us about who Jesus Christ is. And sometimes it's important for us to understand why it's so important to us. What makes the difference between us and what they believe? Just because something is hard to understand doesn't mean it's not true. And a question that was asked in recent centuries, in the 19th century, there was a big theological debate that was called the kenosis theory, where the question was asked of whether Jesus emptied himself of his divine attributes when he was on earth. And this sort of theory, this sort of wrong theory, was developed from those verses we looked at the end of the last session. At the beginning of Philippians chapter 2, we have this amazing passage, this amazing celebration of how Jesus became flesh and came and lived amongst us and died for us and took on that obedience, and as a result of that was elevated to the right hand of God and is deserving and worthy of our worship. This tremendous sort of Christian creed and hymn almost of who Jesus is formed a core debate in the 19th century church, and particularly around verse 7. In some versions of the Bible, it would talk about him having emptied himself. I like the New Living Translation, which says he gave up his divine privileges. But there was a debate where people who believed this theory would said that Jesus gave up his divine qualities and sort of voluntarily self-limited himself in order to fulfill the work of redemption. In other words, he gave up his qualities, as we looked at, those attributes of God, of being omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, those characteristics of God. There was a debate that Jesus gave those up. And sometimes if we don't realise that Jesus was fully God as well as fully human, we might fall into that error of thinking that somehow Jesus gave up something of who he was when he became human. How we can look at this is to realise that what these verses show us is that he took the humble position of a servant or a slave. When he became a human being, he limited himself and chose to do that, but he didn't give up his attributes of being God. The kenosis theory is incorrect, and I want us to really imagine the picture that what we see in this passage is that Jesus chose to give up his position but not his power. The context that Paul's writing to the Philippian church about is the same one that often might be relevant to us today, about how we choose to follow Jesus' example. When Paul was writing to the Philippian church, he was writing from a prison cell. He was writing towards the end of his life, knowing that he was going to be martyred for his faith. And he writes this incredible letter to the church in Philippi, talking about their attitude. And he says to them, lots of things. But he basically says, if you belong to Christ, then love one another, work together with one mind and purpose. Don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as yourself. And then he says, don't look to your own interest, but take an interest in others. And this is where this hymn comes in, because he looks at Jesus' humility, looks at Jesus having given up that position in heaven to become a human being and to become obedient to dying on a cross for our sake. And Paul is encouraging the church to have that same attitude that Jesus had when it comes to our relationships with each other and to other people. I spent some time a few years ago studying Islam, not in any massive depth, but an interest in it. I was working in a city where there was something like 16 mosques, and I had friends who were Muslims, and I wanted to know what it was that they believed and how they acted in order to be able to respond to what is something which is one of the questions for today, for the church today, how we engage with people from another faith. One of the things I learned was that for Muslims, they believed in following what's called the sunnah of the Prophet. In other words, the more they can copy him in what he did, the more brownie points they earn, the more credits they earn. And a Muslim would believe that your credits need to outweigh your bad debts in order for you to qualify for heaven. In other words, you're earning your salvation by copying the example of the Prophet, the sunnah of the Prophet. Even to the point where people I knew would clean their teeth with a stick because that's what the Prophet Muhammad did. For us as Christians, when we talk about following Jesus' example, it's not in the same way that the Muslims would do that with Muhammad. What we're talking about is that following Jesus' example is not in order to earn our salvation, but rather he modelled to us how to live, that we might live spectacularly victorious lives, that we might be able to overcome the work of the enemy. We'd be able to witness to a hurting world that there is a better way to live, a life that's full of grace, full of love, full of mercy, and what we do would become so attractive that other people would say they want that. The invitation we have is to a life in abundance. And Jesus was willing to give up that position in heaven to come and identify with us. I wonder how we respond to that incredible humility and that incredible love to God. Are we willing to give up our rights, or do we want to cling to our rights? What's our response when we look at Jesus being fully God and yet becoming fully man for our sake?